the waterfront feels peripheral when you're in these different outer boroughs in a way. And then when you're actually in New York Harbor, you realize that this is really the center of the city, and so much of the industry and so much of its history is sited in New York Harbor and the various waterways that it connects to. And we've been talking a lot about these sort of the idea of the periphery and how that shifted over the years in New York City in particular, and thinking about the centrality of a place like Manhattan versus maybe historically the centrality of New York City's waterways and New York Harbor. And so we're thinking about ways to make work out here with a number of artists that will explore sort of the possibilities and potentials for this site. It's going to involve both site-specific works being made here in the park, publication, and then public programs that happen all around the city.
So Citizen Bridge is a proposal for a floating sculpture that's also walkable, to basically reconnect Brooklyn to Governor's Island as it once was many, many years ago via sandbar at low tide. And it was in the kind of historical research that I was doing about Buttermilk Channel, which was right outside my window for many, many years. I lived in Red Hook. When I realized that the Waterways, like Mary said, is a vast public space. It's actually the biggest public space we have in New York City, but not that many people realize that A, it is for them, that it is a commons, or B, how to access it. So this project is really a kind of symbolic act to reclaim the waterways as public space. Over the past 4 years, I've been developing this project. I've built 7 different prototypes, all by hand. Buttermilk Channel happens to be one of the most difficult pieces of water in New York City. The currents and the tides together make it one of the most challenging pieces of water to do anything in. And in fact, over the Buttermilk Channel's history, it's been a space of kind of risk and reward. Starting the New York Times back to the late 1800s, in 1874, there were kind of arguments about the value of Buttermilk Channel. Is it for the public or is it for commerce? And so that is a kind of an ongoing conversation, and a conversation that Citizen Bridge is trying to kind of restart again and asking, is there a way to have a yes and? Is there a way to kind of consider multiple uses of the waterways? There are 4 different ways to think about this piece of water. Its use, how one operates on the water, how one puts structures on the water, and the environment. Mary's project and my project, we're really interested in trying to kind of bring the city back to the idea of multiple uses of the waterways.
This is pretty unique. It's one of the few places that I've heard of in New York City, Swale, where you can actually get free food, pick your own free food. With Swale, we really wanted to reinforce the idea that, yes, the water is still a commons, and potentially food should be reinstated as a commons too. It's a rusty old hopper barge, and we have about, I'd say, 100 yards of soil and 80 different types of plants, and a lot of these plants are perennial plants. So what we're doing with the perennial plantings is we're figuring out a way to use companion planting to grow a forest that's stronger and bigger each year that needs less and less care. So that's one of the things that we're trying to share with the Parks Department, is how over time, potentially these sites need less and less maintenance and can provide more and more food. There's a beehive on Swale, and then we're actually using the river water, so we're able to pump the river water into a slow sand filter and a carbon filter, and then through a desalinator to use on the plants. So it's what is called agroforestry. It's not exactly a food forest, which is almost all perennials usually. But that happened just because people ended up planting a lot of their own plants when they came onto Swale, so it changed significantly. With each stop that we go to, the infrastructure, the way that Swale looks and functions, changes pretty significantly from people coming on.
And so if we think about the city as an extension of the human body, something like wastewater infrastructure is part of the natural cycle of input and output. So it's fitting that we're aboard a boat and we're about to go past in this trip 2 of New York City's 14 wastewater treatment plants. And yes, that is a lot of wastewater treatment plants. We produce 1.3 million gallons of wastewater daily and 1,200 tons of biosolids daily. But because it's actually really hard to see these things from the boat, they have a very low profile. I made you some cookies. And if you look at the pictures on the cookies, these are aerial photos of the 2 wastewater treatment plants that we are going to be passing today. The one with the solar panels, that's Port Richmond treatment plant in Staten Island. So this first plant, which is coming up down there somewhere, is the Owl's Head Pollution Control Plant in Bay Ridge. So it's just south of the Brooklyn Army Terminal. And it's sandwiched between a decommissioned rail yard and the Belt Parkway. But then just past the Belt Parkway is Owl's Head Park, which is a very large park, and a residential neighborhood. So the history of the Owl's Head site is actually pretty interesting. It was formerly part of an estate that was owned in the 1600s, actually owned by a black immigrant, mostly a freeman, and then passed from owner to owner, and eventually part of the site was sold off for an Edison Company plant. So that little part was industrial. And then the city filled in the shoreline to make room for the footprint of the wastewater treatment plant. Originally, they considered building an artificial island, but it turned out to be too expensive. But I love to imagine what the harbor would be like with all these little artificial sewage treatment plant islands. It would solve a lot of the environmental justice problems around wastewater treatment. There were, Owl's Head began operations in 1952. The other one, which will pass, the Port Richmond plant, began operation in 1953. There were actually 5 wastewater treatment plants built in New York in the 1950s. We use this infrastructure every day, but our collective waste becomes a burden on the people who live near it. So because this infrastructure does stink, and trust me, it really stinks. But both this plant and the one in Staten Island were modernized very recently, mostly due to extensive complaining from the people around them. Like, let's hear it for citizen complaints, right? Sometimes it actually gets stuff done. So they stink a lot less.
I can point out the waste transfer station. It's the big blue building. That's the Staten Island Waste Transfer Station. And the orange containers there are where the trash gets repackaged. On site, there are 2 plants. One is the methane recovery plant, and the other is the leachate recovery plant. And the methane recovery plant cleans the methane from the CO2 and puts the methane directly into National Grid's pipeline. So that is natural gas that is being used by thousands of Staten Island homes for heating and cooking energy. And then the leachate gets put into this other processing plant, which cleans the water. The clean water gets put into the Arthur Kill, and the byproduct of that is a sludge cake. On our left is the Isle of Meadows. It was a piece of property that was acquired by the city of New York, but never landfilled, and actually became a bird sanctuary for a long time. Those birds have not been so present at the Isle of Meadows anymore because they have so much other grassland on the interior of the site to make their habitats. So in 2001, when the decision was final to close the landfill, successfully closed, the Municipal Art Society of New York, which is an urban advocacy group here in the city, said to Mayor Giuliani, New York City is never going to acquire this much land ever again, and why would we just close it as a landfill and keep the gates closed? We should make this into a park. There's plenty of precedents for that we're going into the center of the site via the waterways, and that this is a really rich territory for us to explore through art.